Why are you so sensitive? It was just a joke, she laughed after embarrassing me in front of her friends. I smiled and played along. Then I walked out mid-dinner, blocked her everywhere, and let her explain my disappearance to everyone sitting at that table. Hey viewers, before we move on to the video, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button if you want to see more stories like this. Thanks. Why are you so sensitive? She laughed. Not a quiet laugh, not a nervous one. A full, loud, throw your head back kind of laugh that bounced off the walls of that restaurant like it owned the place. It was just a joke. She waved her hand at me like I was being ridiculous. Like I was the problem. Like the 8 people sitting around that table weren't all staring at me with that specific kind of pity that makes your skin crawl. I felt my jaw tighten. I felt my hands go still under the table. And I smiled. I smiled the way you smile when every cell in your body is telling you to get up and leave, but your brain is still running the keep the peace protocol that you've been running for 2 years straight. You're right, I said. I'm being too sensitive. She grinned, satisfied, and turned back to her friends like the moment was over. Like I was over. But I wasn't over. I was just getting started. I'm 28 years old. I had been with Cassie for just under 2 years. We met through mutual friends at a rooftop party, dated for 4 months before making it official, and by the time this dinner happened, I had moved into her apartment complex. Not her apartment, but the building next door, close enough that we shared keys and practically lived together without the actual commitment of sharing a lease. That matters, because when you live that close to someone, you think you know them. You think you've seen all their sides. You haven't. The dinner was at a place called Archer's. Upscale, not fancy, but the kind of restaurant where the menus don't have prices listed and the candles are real and the waitstaff are trained to smile at you even when you've been sitting at your table for 4 hours. Cassie had organized it. Her idea, her invite list, her energy. 8 of us total. Her best friend Haley, who I genuinely liked. Haley's boyfriend Tom, who was quiet and easy to be around. Her work friends Dana and Will, who I had met maybe 3 times and found perfectly harmless. And then 2 people I had never met before. A couple named Chris and Brooke who apparently Cassie had been close with in college and who had just moved back to the city. That detail, the fact that Chris and Brooke were new, that Cassie was performing for an audience that didn't know me yet, that detail is important. I didn't know how important until later. We got there first, Cassie and I. She was in a good mood. Bright eyes, her hair down, wearing this emerald green dress she knew I loved. She squeezed my hand when we walked in and said, "I'm so excited for you to meet Chris and Brooke. You're going to love them." I squeezed back. "Can't wait," I said. And I meant it. I was in a good mood too. I had no reason not to be. Work had been going well. I had just closed a deal that had been dragging for 3 months, and my manager had pulled me aside that afternoon to tell me that I was being considered for a team lead position. I was happy. I was actually genuinely happy going into that dinner, which makes everything that happened next hit so much harder when I think about it now. The table filled up slowly. Haley and Tom arrived together, Haley hugging Cassie like she hadn't seen her in years even though they'd had lunch 2 days before. Tom shook my hand, asked how work was going. We talked about a soccer game for a few minutes. Normal. Dana and Will came in together even though they weren't a couple. Dana immediately launching into a story about her commute that had everyone at the table groaning and laughing. And then Chris and Brooke arrived. Cassie lit up in a way I hadn't seen in a while. She stood up, practically ran around the table, and hugged them both for longer than a standard greeting hug. "Oh my God, you're actually here," she kept saying. "You're actually here." I stood when they approached, smiled, extended my hand. "Good to finally meet you both. I've heard a lot." Chris shook my hand firmly, smiled back. "Same man." Brooke gave me a quick hug and said Cassie talked about me all the time, which felt like a good sign. We settled back in. Orders were placed. Wine was poured, and the table found its rhythm quickly the way dinner tables do when most people already know each other. And for the first 40 minutes, everything was fine. Everything was actually great. I was talking, laughing, contributing to the conversation. Chris was telling a story about some disaster that happened on a camping trip he and Cassie went on years ago, back when they were in college, and I was genuinely entertained. "The tent collapsed in the middle of the night," he said, laughing. "Like, fully, completely, catastrophically collapsed. And Cassie just started screaming," Brooke added. "Not because she was hurt, just because she was mad." "I was cold," Cassie said, pointing at Brooke accusingly. "There is a difference." Everyone laughed. I laughed too. It was a good story. It was a good night. right up until it wasn't. The shift was subtle at first, the way those things usually are. It started with a comment about my job. I had mentioned the deal I closed, mentioned the team lead thing, not in a bragging way. Someone asked what was new, and I answered. "That's amazing," Haley said. "Honestly, that sounds like it's been a stressful few months." "It has," I said, "but it paid off." And Cassie, who was mid-sip of her wine, lowered her glass and said with this little smirk, "He's been stressed about it nonstop, though." I looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you've been kind of a lot lately," she said, still smiling. "Like, a little high maintenance about the whole thing." There was a beat of silence. Dana made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. I felt something tighten in my chest, but I let it go. "I mean, yeah, it was a big deal," I said lightly. "I think a little stress is pretty normal." "Of course it is," Cassie said, patting my arm in a way that felt condescending. "I'm just saying." She went back to her wine. I watched her for half a second longer than I should have, then looked away. I told myself it was nothing. I had gotten good at telling myself that. Because with Cassie, there was always a small thing here, a throwaway comment there, and every time I brought it up, it became a much bigger thing than the original comment ever warranted. Or so she said. "You always make everything so heavy," she told me once, back in the summer. "I say one thing, and you turn it into this whole conversation." So I had trained myself to let things go, to absorb them, to file them away in a folder I never opened, and keep smiling and keep the evening moving forward. That folder was getting pretty full by the night of this dinner, but I didn't know how full until I was sitting there under those restaurant lights, watching her smile at her friends and wondering when I had started feeling so small. 20 minutes later, the comments started building. It wasn't one big moment. It was a series of little ones, stacked one on top of the other like someone quietly loading a shelf. Chris asked me how Cassie and I met, and before I could answer, she jumped in with, "He was too nervous to talk to me at first. It took him like 3 separate attempts to actually say something coherent." She said it warmly. The way you say things when you're framing a story is sweet. But I remembered that night differently. I hadn't been nervous. I had been talking to someone else when I first noticed her, and I had taken my time, had a conversation, and then walked over. That's not nervousness. That's just normal human behavior. But the table was laughing, and Cassie was glowing, and I said, "That's not really what happened," with a smile. "It's basically what happened," she said. "He was adorably awkward." I wasn't really. "It's fine," she said. "It's cute." The word cute landed like a small, sharp thing, like she was describing a child. Chris laughed. "Man, we've all been there," he said. And the conversation moved on. I moved on with it. Another item on the shelf. Then came the moment about my apartment. Will had asked if Cassie and I had thought about moving in together officially, and Cassie had made this theatrical sigh like the question itself was exhausting. "We've talked about it," she said. "But," she paused, smiled, glanced at me. "He has some interesting habits." "Cassie." My voice was even. Mild even. Just her name, just a gentle redirect. "What?" she said. "It's funny." "What habits?" Haley asked, in that tone that was genuinely curious but could also fan a flame. "He has this system," Cassie said, leaning forward like she was about to reveal something. "For his kitchen." She made the word system sound like something between a quirk and a disorder. "He organizes everything by type and then by frequency of use. And if anything is even slightly out of place, he gets this look on his face." She did an impression of the look. I don't know exactly what face she made, because I was staring at the table, but the table laughed. "I mean, that's just being organized," Tom said, and I genuinely wanted to thank him. "It's more than organized," Cassie said. "It's like a whole personality trait." She laughed. The table laughed. I laughed. But my laugh was the kind that's basically just a sound. Just a noise you make so no one asks you what's wrong. I was aware of something happening in my body that I couldn't fully name. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It wasn't hurt, not exactly. It was something more like a slow, quiet understanding. The kind that settles into you the way cold water does when you've been sitting in a bath that's been cooling for the last hour. You don't notice it until you're already cold. I had been cooling for a long time. I just hadn't noticed until now. The actual moment happened over dessert. Menus had been passed around. Everyone was debating whether to get something sweet, and somehow the conversation had turned to embarrassing stories. Brooke had shared one about spilling an entire tray of drinks at a party in college. Tom had told a self-deprecating story about locking himself out of his car in a parking garage for 2 hours. Even Dana, who I had barely spoken to all evening, had shared something about mispronouncing a word in a work presentation. And then Cassie, with this bright gleam in her eye that I should have recognized as a warning sign, said, "Oh, I have one." She looked at me. She looked at me, and I felt it. I felt what was coming in my stomach before she even said a word. "Last month," she said, pausing for effect, "we were at his company's little end-of-quarter thing." She said little in a way that telegraphed she had not found it impressive. And they were doing this thing where people stand up and talk about their contributions for the quarter. "Okay," Chris said, nodding along. And he stands up. She looked around the table. And he starts talking. And he's like, fully rehearsed. You can tell he's practiced this. She said rehearsed like it was something embarrassing. Like preparation was something to mock. And at one point he goes completely blank. She snapped her fingers. Like, mid-sentence, just gone. "Oh no," Haley said softly. Full silence, Cassie said, lifting her wine glass. For like a long time. "Cassie." My voice was low. She didn't hear it. Or she heard it and chose to keep going. And then he kind of laughs, says, "I lost my train of thought," and sits back down. She shook her head with this fondness that felt completely manufactured. It was honestly the most adorable thing I've ever seen, but also I wanted to die for him. The table reacted. Some of them laughed. Will said, "That's the worst feeling." Haley, to her credit, said, "That happens to everyone though. It's not a big deal." But the damage wasn't in the story. The damage was in the delivery. The damage was in the word adorable. The damage was in the phrase "I wanted to die for him." The damage was in the way she was looking at me right now, smiling, checking whether I was smiling too. And I was smiling. Because what else was I going to do at a table with 8 people in a restaurant where I had no car and her friends were staring at me waiting for my reaction? "It happens," I said. My voice was perfectly normal, perfectly calm. "Everyone goes blank sometimes." "Of course," Cassie said. "I'm not saying it was a big deal. I'm just saying it was funny." "It's funny," I agreed. She squeezed my arm. "You're such a good sport," she said. And that was the sentence. That was the sentence that broke something in me. Not the story, not the embarrassment. The "you're such a good sport." Because that sentence was designed to close the loop. It was designed to frame everything she had just done as a test of my easygoingness, a test I had supposedly passed, a gold star for tolerating what she had just put me through in front of people I had only met an hour ago. "You're such a good sport." As though I didn't have feelings. As though my feelings were an obstacle she had just successfully gotten around. I nodded. I picked up my water glass and took a long sip. And across the table, Chris was laughing about something else already, and Dana was getting the waiter's attention, and the table had moved on in the way dinner tables do. But I hadn't moved on. For the first time in a long time, I stopped filing things away. I let them sit in front of me. I looked at them. I replayed the last 2 years in the span of about 60 seconds while the dessert menus were being handed around. I thought about the birthday dinner she had thrown me last year, where she had told a story about how I had cried during a movie in front of all of her friends. I had told her that story in private. I had shared it as a vulnerable moment. She had turned it into content. I thought about the time we had an argument about her consistently being late, a real argument where I had laid out how it made me feel disrespected, and how she had ended the conversation by saying, "You know what your problem is? You think everything is a big deal." I thought about the way she introduced me to people sometimes. Not always. Not even usually. But sometimes. There was a way she introduced me that put me very slightly below her in the social hierarchy of whatever room we were in. Nothing you could point to directly. Nothing you could hold up and say, "Look at this. Look at what she's doing." Just a tone. Just an inflection. Just the word adorable when she could have said impressive. Just the word high maintenance when she could have said dedicated. Just the phrase "I wanted to die for him" when she could have just not told the story at all. I had been letting these things go for so long that I hadn't noticed they were building a version of myself inside that relationship that I didn't recognize. A smaller version. A softer-edged, more apologetic, more accommodating version. A version that smiled when he wanted to leave. I was done being that version. The dessert arrived. I had ordered something. I couldn't tell you what it was, and I was pushing it around the plate while the table talked about a trip someone was planning, while Cassie refilled her wine and laughed at something Chris said, while the candle in the middle of the table flickered. I made a quiet decision. No announcement. No drama. No confrontation in front of everyone. Just a decision. And then I waited. I waited for the right moment. The natural pause in the conversation where my standing up wouldn't disrupt anything, wouldn't demand attention, would just be a man getting up from a table. That pause came about 4 minutes later. Tom had gotten up to use the restroom. Haley was checking her phone. Dana and Will were having a sidebar conversation. Chris and Brooke were looking at something on Brooke's phone, and Cassie was talking to no one in particular, gesturing with her wine glass, mid-thought. I put my napkin on the table. I picked up my jacket from the back of my chair. I stood up quietly, and I walked toward the exit. Not fast, not dramatically, just a man walking toward a door. I heard Cassie say, behind me, "Where are you?" And then I was outside. The cold air hit me first. Then the silence. The beautiful, sharp, specific silence of not being in that room anymore. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment. I breathed. Then I took out my phone. I called a car. While I waited, I opened my contacts, found Cassie's name, and blocked her number. Not out of anger. Not impulsively. Deliberately. The way you close a door you have no intention of reopening. Then I opened every app we communicated on. Instagram, WhatsApp, Snapchat, the texting app we both used because it had better group chat features. One by one. Blocked, 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 blocked. By the time my car arrived, I was unreachable. I got in, gave my address, put my phone face down on the seat next to me, and watched the city pass through the window. I didn't feel dramatic. I didn't feel like I was making some grand statement. I felt like I had finally picked up something I had been stepping over for a very long time. I felt like myself. I want to be honest about what the next part of my night looked like, because it wasn't the triumphant solo montage that this kind of story usually implies. I got home. I made tea because I wasn't hungry anymore. I sat on my couch in the dark for about 20 minutes without turning on a single light. And I thought about her. Not in a miss her way. In a what just happened way. In a how did I get here way. Because the thing is, Cassie wasn't a villain. That's the hard part of this story. She wasn't cruel in the way that's easy to name and dismiss. She was charming and funny and warm in ways that were completely real. She made the best coffee I'd ever tasted, and she remembered every small thing I ever mentioned in passing, and she had this laugh that made you want to say funny things just to hear it again. She was also someone who used me as a punchline. Not constantly, not maliciously, but consistently. And every time I had tried to address it, she had reframed it so expertly that I had ended up apologizing for bringing it up. That's the pattern I hadn't been able to name while I was inside it. I was naming it now. I thought about the first time I had tried to tell her that the public jokes bothered me. We had been at a house party, maybe 6 months into the relationship, and she had told a group of people a story about how I had gotten mildly lost while navigating during a road trip. It was nothing. A wrong turn, 30 minutes added to the journey. We had laughed about it in the car. But the way she told it at the party made me sound helpless. Made me sound like a man who couldn't figure out a GPS. I had pulled her aside later and said, gently, that it hadn't felt great. She had stared at me for a moment. Then she had said, "You're joking." "No," I had said. "I just want to mention it, not make it a thing." "It wasn't a mean story," she said. "I know, but..." "Everybody laughed," she said. "It was a funny story." "Sure, I can't believe you're making this a thing," she said. And she had walked back into the party. And I had stood in that hallway for a moment, genuinely unsure if I was being unreasonable. That was the moment I should have paid more attention to. That was the moment the folder started filling up. The second time I had brought it up, we were at her sister's birthday, and she had made a comment in front of her whole family about how I was hopeless with money, which wasn't even true. I wasn't hopeless with money. I was just less obsessed with tracking every penny than she was, which I had always seen as a difference in approach, not a character flaw. But at the table, surrounded by her family, she had laughed and said, "Don't ask him about investments. He still has a savings account at the same bank he opened when he was 16. Which was true, and also none of anyone's business. When I brought it up later, she said, "My family loved you tonight. I don't understand what the problem is." "The problem is the comment about my finances," I said. "I was joking," she said. "You're so sensitive." There it was. The first time she said it to me. The sentence that would eventually be the last thing she said to me in a public setting. "You're so sensitive." I had absorbed it that night too. I had gone quiet. I had told myself she didn't mean it. I had told myself she was tired, that it was a long family event, that everyone says things they don't mean sometimes. I had been very good at finding excuses for her. I was done finding excuses. Sitting on my dark couch with my tea going cold, I thought about what was probably happening at Archer's right now. I thought about the moment she realized I had left. I thought about the half-second of confusion, checking the restroom, checking the door. I thought about when she picked up her phone and saw nothing. No notification. No text saying I had to leave. Something came up. No red receipt on the message she had probably sent. Just silence. I thought about how she was going to have to turn back to that table and explain where I had gone. I thought about Chris and Brooke watching her face as she processed it. About Haley, who knew me well enough to understand that I didn't do impulsive things, watching her friend try to spin a story that had no easy spin. I didn't feel guilty. I want to be clear about that. I had been trying not to feel guilty for 2 years. I had worked very hard at it, and I was done working at things that should come naturally. 3 days passed. Cassie found a way to reach me eventually, because Cassie was resourceful. She texted Haley, and Haley, being a decent human being and also someone I think genuinely cared about both of us, sent me a message asking if I was okay. I told her I was. I told her I appreciated her reaching out. I told her the short version, that I had spent a long time absorbing things that I should have addressed sooner, and that this dinner had been the moment I realized the pattern wasn't going to change. Haley was quiet for a while. Then she said, "I've wanted to say something to her about the jokes for a long time." That hit me somewhere deep, because it meant other people had seen it. It meant I hadn't been imagining it, hadn't been misinterpreting it, hadn't been too sensitive after all. Other people had noticed. Other people had just stayed quiet about it. Which meant so had I. Which meant she had never had a reason to stop. Cassie eventually reached me through a co-worker of mine named Owen, who I genuinely felt bad about dragging into this. Owen knocked on my office door one afternoon with this careful look on his face and said, "Hey, I got a DM from someone named Cassie who said she's your girlfriend and can't reach you." I told Owen I was sorry, that I hadn't anticipated her doing that, and that he didn't need to relay any messages. Owen said, completely fair, with a look that suggested he had heard some version of this situation before and had no opinions about it, which I respected enormously. That evening, I received a letter. An actual, physical letter pushed under my apartment door. I stood in my entryway and looked at it for a long moment before picking it up. It was 3 pages, handwritten. The first page was confusion. Why did I leave? What happened? Did she do something wrong? She couldn't think of what she could have done that would make me leave like that without saying anything. The second page was hurt. She had been humiliated in front of Chris and Brooke, people she had been trying to reconnect with, and who she had built up in her mind for months. She had sat at that table and had no idea what to tell them. She had driven home alone. She had cried. I believed her. I believed that she had been hurt. The third page was where it got complicated. The third page was the apology, but the apology wasn't quite right. It said, "If I said something that upset you, I'm sorry." If. 2 letters. Small word. Enormous weight. I know I can be a lot sometimes, and I know you're sensitive about certain things. There it was again. The reframe. Not. I said things that were unkind and public and designed to make me look easygoing at your expense. But you were sensitive about certain things. The apology was real in its emotion, but it still couldn't find a way to call the thing what it was. I sat with that letter for a long time. I thought about what it would look like to respond. I thought about the conversation we would have, the way she would start with genuine remorse and slowly, inevitably, migrate toward explaining how her intentions had been good, how I had misread the tone, how everyone at the table had been laughing not at me, but with me. I had had versions of that conversation before. I knew how it ended. It ended with me apologizing for being upset. I didn't write back. A week later, Haley told me that Cassie had told their friends that we had broken up over a miscommunication. I found that interesting. Not upsetting, just interesting. Because a miscommunication implies 2 people misunderstanding each other, an equal distribution of confusion. What had actually happened was not a miscommunication. What had happened was a pattern that had communicated itself very clearly for a very long time, and I had finally understood it completely. That wasn't a miscommunication. That was clarity. I want to talk about the part of this that I didn't handle perfectly. Because I didn't. Leaving without a word was a choice that was right for me in that moment. But I can acknowledge that it left Cassie in an unfair position publicly. She had to sit at that table and manage other people's confusion while also dealing with her own. That wasn't kind, even if it was the only move I felt capable of making in that moment. I'm not going to pretend I walked out of that restaurant in some perfectly controlled, morally clean way. I walked out because I had been swallowing things for so long that if I had stayed one more minute at that table, I would have either said something I regretted or cried in public, and neither of those felt like an option. Leaving was the only thing between me and those 2 outcomes. But I can hold both things at once. I can know that I was right to leave, and also know that the leaving could have been handled differently. What I don't second guess is the blocking. The blocking was an act of self-preservation, not revenge. Because I knew, with total certainty, that if she had been able to reach me that night, I would have answered. And if I had answered, I would have been back at that table, metaphorically, within a week. Smiling when I wanted to leave. Absorbing. Filing. Being a good sport. I couldn't go back to being that version of myself. I like myself too much. I've thought a lot about the specific way she said it at dinner. Why are you so sensitive? It was just a joke. Because those two sentences do something specific. The first one turns the issue into a character flaw. It's not about what I said, it's about what you are. You are someone who reacts this way. You are the problem. The second sentence minimizes the action while the first maximizes the reaction. A joke is small. Your sensitivity is big. Therefore, the sensitivity is disproportionate. Therefore, you are the unreasonable one. Therefore, the conversation is over before it begins. It's a very efficient piece of deflection. And I don't think she used it consciously. I don't think she sat at home designing linguistic traps. But the efficiency of it suggests she had used it before. Probably long before she met me. Probably with other people who, like me, had eventually gone quiet. I'm not going to tell you that I'm completely fine. That would be too clean. 2 years with someone doesn't just dissolve the moment you make a decision. There are mornings where I wake up and the first thing I think about is the way she smelled in the morning, the specific warm coffee and something else smell of her apartment. And there's a dull ache in that thought that I'm not going to pretend isn't real. There are evenings where I'll be cooking and I'll do something in the kitchen, use my organizational system, specifically, and I'll notice I'm slightly annoyed that I spent any amount of time defending that system to anyone. There are moments where I miss the version of us that existed in the first year, before I started noticing the jokes, before the folder started filling up. That version was real too. I'm not retroactively rewriting it as something it wasn't. But the version of us that existed by the night of that dinner was not healthy. And I think some part of me had known it for a long time and just hadn't been willing to say so. The last thing I want to say about all of this is about the table. I've thought about the people sitting at that table a lot. Haley, who had seen the pattern and said nothing. Tom, who stepped in mildly when he said my kitchen organization was just being organized. Dana and Will, who didn't know me well enough to have an opinion. Chris and Brooke, who had just moved back to the city and were meeting me for the first time. I think about what those two people saw at that dinner. They saw a woman who told stories about her partner that positioned him as someone to be gently laughed at. They saw a man who smiled and absorbed it. And then they saw that man get up and leave. Quietly. Without a scene. Without a speech. Without giving her the opportunity to redirect the narrative in real time. They saw her sit at that table and have to explain it. And they didn't have enough context to accept whatever explanation she gave them. I hope that mattered. Not as a punishment. Not as revenge. But as information. Because people show you who they are in public. And sometimes the people sitting at the table need to see it clearly before the person doing the showing even realizes they're doing it. The last time I interacted with anything related to Cassie was a post I saw on Instagram, through Haley's story, since I obviously wasn't following her anymore, from a few weeks after the dinner. A photo of her at a coffee shop, looking relaxed, with a caption that said something about fresh starts and new chapters. She looked good. She looked genuinely okay. And I felt something that surprised me. Not jealousy, not anger, relief. Because if she was okay, then this could just be the end of something. Not a wound that needed tending. Not a story that needed a resolution beyond the one it already had. Just two people who were wrong for each other in a specific and important way, who had now gone their separate directions. That was enough. That was actually more than enough. I went back to Archer's once, about a month later, on a completely different night, with Owen from work and a couple of other people. I sat in a different section. I ordered the steak this time, which I had been meaning to try the first time and hadn't gotten around to. The evening was easy and loud and unremarkable in the best possible way. Nobody made me the punchline. Nobody told a story about me that I hadn't chosen to tell myself. Nobody looked at me with that specific restaurant candlelight pity that makes your skin crawl. I ate my steak. I laughed at things that were actually funny. I walked home at the end of the night, and I felt the temperature of the air and the specific quiet of the city at 11 p.m., and I thought about how long it had been since I felt this light. I thought, not for the last time, about a man at a dinner table picking up his jacket, standing up, walking toward a door, not dramatically, not with a speech, just a man deciding he was done. That man, I thought, made the right call. To anyone reading this who recognizes the folder I described, the one you keep filling up and never opening, I want to say something simple. The size of the folder doesn't determine whether you're allowed to address it. One item in the folder is enough. One time you swallowed something you shouldn't have swallowed is enough to have the conversation. You don't have to wait until a dinner table with 8 people and a plate of dessert you don't even touch before you're permitted to walk toward the door. The door is always there. You can leave at any time. A year ago, I would have stayed at that table. A year ago, I would have smiled through the rest of the meal, kissed her on the cheek in the car on the way home, and filed the night away in that folder. But something had been shifting in me quietly. Something had been building the way pressure builds. And that night, under those restaurant lights, when she laughed and asked me why I was so sensitive, I realized that I had never once been the problem. I had just been very politely told that I was. For 2 years. By someone I thought knew me. Someone who had decided, somewhere along the way, that knowing me and using me as material were the same thing. They weren't. They're never the same thing. I walked out. I blocked her. I let her explain my disappearance to 8 people sitting around a table in a restaurant with real candles and no prices on the menu. And I never looked back. Not because I wasn't hurt, but because I finally understood something. Taking care of yourself isn't sensitivity. It isn't being dramatic. It isn't being a lot. It isn't being high maintenance. It is the most basic, most non-negotiable thing you can do for yourself. And it took me 2 years, a dinner, a quiet walk toward a door, and a letter I never answered to fully understand that. But I understand it now. And that's the only ending this story needed.